My name is Stefan Wolff. I'm Professor of International Security at the University of Birmingham in England, United Kingdom. I think that mostly has to do with a prolonged pattern of exclusion of particular groups from society. So lots of societies obviously face risks because they are very plural, they are very diverse, they include various linguistic, religious, ethnic communities. But that in itself is not the problem. The problem is if some of these groups are permanently excluded, either politically from major political bodies or decision-making procedures, culturally if they are not respected with their particular identity, if it is not recognized that their religious, linguistic, ethnic identity is as important, as equal as any of the others. But of course we also have problems sometimes with cultural, social, economic exclusion. So if we have patterns in a sense that some groups are permanently underrepresented in particular professions, if they do not have the same opportunities to participate economically, sometimes even if they are excluded from particular pathways in education, all of that, I think if we have long-term patterns of that, that exacerbates risks that are naturally present in societies that are diverse. And it is these patterns of exclusion, I think, that we need to watch in order to sort of act early on potential failures or breakdowns in pluralism. Well, I mean, as I just said, I mean, it's the prolonged denial of particular rights or claims that that groups legitimately make. So it's not in the sense that we face these breakdowns suddenly overnight. I mean, there's usually a long build-up towards a particular crisis or an escalation into violence. And it is both, in a sense, the way in which particular demands are presented by those that feel discriminated against or excluded from particular elements of citizenship, but it's also the way in which governments respond to these demands. So if it is not in itself the exclusion or the demand to be included that causes the problem, but how political leaders, how groups deal with these issues. So in that sense, it can be a violent crackdown that leads to an escalation of a crisis, but it can also be the violent turn of protests, for example. So I think from that perspective, we need to bear in mind that there is a responsibility on both sides. Those that exclude or that are thought to follow exclusive policies and those that feel excluded. And from my perspective, what always is sort of the an early indicator towards well, a scenario that you wouldn't want, sort of a nasty escalation of a particular situation, is if people stop talking, if they don't talk anymore across a divide that they perceive to exist, but they start talking primarily to themselves, and they convince their followers that their position is the only right one and that is the one that needs to be defended or challenged in that sense. So from this perspective, it is in a way a breakdown of trust, a breakdown of confidence, of communication between groups that is very often an early sign that is also a sign that can be recognized and can be acted upon. That leads to the kind of violent conflict, civil wars that we have seen just too many of over the past decade or two. I think these are very complicated issues in a sense, in particular because a lot of the early warning that we have now really focuses on issues that are very close to crisis point already, or where we already have a crisis, even though it need not sort of be a violent crisis yet. So I think in that sense, risk, I think, is a general condition that, or a set of conditions that a lot of societies face. So You have very diverse societies, you may have economic pressures, you may have environmental pressures. I mean, just think of the impact of climate change, for example. So I think here risk is a very broad and general category of a whole host of different factors. But none of these factors necessarily in themselves need to be seen as inevitably leading to an escalation, leading to a crisis, leading to sort of the organized systematic use of violence. At the same time, I think it's also that sometimes it just can be one additional sort of factor that comes into play, sort of the proverbial last straw that broke the camel's back. So we need not see necessarily an escalation over time. It can just be that at some point something that 3, 5, 10 years ago would not have triggered a crisis suddenly is one step too far and generates a violent response. So that can be yet another rigged election, for example, and after 3 or 4 times, a group that has been permanently excluded by electoral manipulation simply feels that's enough, and they take up arms and violently challenge this kind of manipulation of the democratic process. On the other hand, it can also be just one more blog post, for example, one more social media campaign that a regime feels really threatened by, and then they escalate by rounding up people that they perceive as potential ringleaders of protests or dissidents and so on and so forth. And all of that can then set off a spiral of escalation towards violence that may be very, very difficult to stop. So I think in that sense, what we really need to do for effective early warning is to look much, much further upstream, as it were. So we have to look at societies that exhibit certain risk factors and then monitor systematically how they are moving on the continuum between inclusion and exclusion. And if they become more and more exclusive, then that obviously is an indication that they are moving down toward a very, very dangerous trajectory. But if we start early monitoring such societies, then we will also be able to identify particular points or moments when intervention might actually change something. When we come to a critical juncture where then the international community or particular regional organizations, regional powers can work with governments and encourage them to take certain steps and not others. Work with the opposition, for example, not to escalate unnecessarily and risk violence. So from that perspective, early warning really needs to put more of an emphasis on the early rather than on the warning when in crisis, when a crisis is already fully underway. I don't think it's so much the idea that we need a new global, I mean, we need a new approach, I think, but it's not for a lack of a global approach. There are a lot of different existing mechanisms, but most of them really focus on countries that are already very, very far down a trajectory towards violent escalation, and that in some cases have gone so far that it's really difficult to see how a credible turnaround could be engineered. And this is not to say that this is not important, because these are very often the countries that sort of escalate towards major humanitarian disasters, for example. So clearly something needs to be done about those. But there is another issue that it need not actually come to that point. So a new approach to early warning really would need to start much, much earlier. As I said in answer to a previous question, I mean, it is relatively easy to identify countries that exhibit certain risk factors. So from that perspective, there would be an additional component in early warning that would focus on countries that are not yet in crisis mode or have degenerated into civil war, and then look at these countries, work with the governments there, work with society more broadly. I mean, religious leaders, leaders of particular cultural or ethnic communities, sort of civil society more broadly, and think about ways and mechanisms in which sort of trends towards more exclusion can be stopped and reversed, and more inclusive practices of citizenship can be promoted, so that in the end there is a greater sense of all the different segments of society that this is their society, that they have a responsibility but also an opportunity to make sure that the diverse nature of their society doesn't drive them down a pathway towards violence. And I think this, in a sense, would be, if you want, or is at the moment a missing component, and that has a lot to do with the fact that it's a capacity issue. I mean, we are already monitoring a lot of countries that are in a really, really bad place. So there would be additional capacity necessary to start monitoring countries that are not that far down the road. It's also a question, if you work with countries that are not in crisis mode yet, can you justify the expense of doing that? There aren't that many kudos in working with countries and preventing something that is always difficult to prove that you have actually prevented it. So there's sort of a public relations aspect of that that simply doesn't make it very attractive for governments or international organizations to invest that far into upstream prevention. And all that said, however, it is very obvious that it is much easier to prevent at an early stage when you actually haven't made some choices that will be much more difficult to reverse at a later stage, when you have had a breakdown of relationships, when trust has been eroded between different communities. So a new global approach to early warning, I think, is needed, but in the sense that we need to complement the existing mechanisms, which also in a way will take off some of the pressure of sort of the number and scope of the global crises that we are dealing with at the moment. Well, I think that actually the way in which the question is phrased supposes that Syria is an early warning failure, but I'm not so sure that this is actually the case. I think Syria we have to see in a relatively broad context. So it's Syria is, on the one hand, it's part of the Arab Spring, but it's also a country that exists physically, geographically, in a very, very complicated region where you have existing protracted conflicts, where you have a climate of regional instability, especially over the last 10 years with the events in Iraq in particular. You have a lot of geopolitical rivalry, whether it's sort of the last remaining Russian ally in the Middle East, whether it's the whole question of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, whether it's the issue around Israel and the Palestinian territories. So there's a lot of additional factors that I think make me question whether there were actually that many choices, that many options available to act even at an earlier stage. I mean, it became clear very quickly that there was a real and really bad escalation happening very, very quickly in Syria. But even at this stage, I think the options were limited. So, for example, if you look at some of the alternative scenarios that are being touted around right now, yes, more influence, more pressure could have been exercised, for example, on the opposition, to at least give it another try when Assad offered sort of constitutional reforms in the early wake of the uprising in Syria. Maybe it wasn't the smartest choice to preclude a negotiated transition by saying Assad must go. maybe more material, including military support, should have been given to what we used to call the moderate opposition when it was still existing. And that may have created a different balance of power on the ground compared to what we see now. Maybe more pressure should have been put on the Iraqi government, for example, to make sure that they do not have this prolonged crisis of governance, of even government formation in their country, which also contributed to the larger Sunni-Shia divide in the region. But I mean, not only can you always argue with the benefit of hindsight that so many things could have been done differently, but none of these options, I would argue, were without risks or potentially negative consequences. So I think from that perspective, Syria, I mean, demonstrates two things to me. On the one hand, we need to be really realistic about how much we can do in terms of early warning, early action at a very, very late stage of a pluralism failure or breakdown. And that in turn then emphasizes my earlier point about how important it actually is to think much further ahead, to start much more upstream. I mean, yes, the Arab Spring happened relatively quickly, spreading from Tunisia through Libya, Egypt, into Syria, Bahrain, and so on and so forth. But still, I mean, we are talking several months here before we had sort of various escalations in different countries and then the different responses to that. But these several months could have been used to work much more proactively with some countries. But also, I mean, it emphasizes another point, which is that, I mean, local leaders have their own sets of responsibilities, so we can't always blame it on a supposed international community for doing some things and not doing others. If you compare, for example, the way in which the events in Tunisia involved, how the events in Jordan evolved, and what happened in Libya and Syria, I mean, you can clearly see that different leaders, both in the opposition and in the regimes, responded very, very differently to these events. So in Jordan, the king made a much more sincere and much more believable effort of opening the system, reforming the system. In Tunisia, the dictator, so-called, left the country. In Yemen, we had a negotiated transition. So all of that emphasizes the point that there are a number of critical junctures in a process of pluralism failure and pluralism breakdown, and at these junctures people make choices. And the more we understand what possible options they have, what choices they can make, the more we will be able, hopefully, to influence certain trajectories and preventing a descent into the kind of chaos that I mean, we see in Syria, but also let's not forget about Libya, which, despite a decisive international intervention and a reasonably successful regime change, has descended into complete chaos. So, I mean, if you compare Libya and Syria, you could say, well, early warning, early action in Libya produced pretty much the same outcome as not much early warning and certainly no early action produced in Syria. So I think from that perspective, it's also about managing our expectations, about how effective any kind of action can be once a country has sort of crossed a certain threshold into a real breakdown of pluralism. Well, I think that very much again depends on sort of the point at which we are talking about sort of warning and action. I mean, obviously, the earlier we have the warning, the earlier we take action, the more choices we have, and the less costly some of the choices will be, both for people on the outside, regional, international organizations, but also for the people on the inside. So from that perspective, again, I mean, the important point for me in all of this is to really focus on the early warning rather than on the warning when things have already gone wrong. The other point, of course, is that I mean, there is a limit in terms of what can be done from the outside. I mean, in the end, solutions, if you can call them that, to pluralism failures and pluralism breakdowns have to be owned locally. So I mean, people really need to believe in particular options, in particular choices that they make. This obviously needs to be facilitated from the outside. Very often, especially in sort of late stage crises, when you have had a breakdown of relationships, if trust is gone, if you have sort of a historic pattern of failures and breakdowns that ended up with mass atrocities, for example, it's very, very limited in terms of what leaders within the country can do without outside assistance. And then this outside assistance can take different forms. So it can either mean to create a safe space where people can talk. It can mean putting pressure on those that are unwilling to talk, whether it's the opposition, whether it's the regime. It can mean providing incentives where it's not a lack of will, but a lack of capacity to come up with proper solutions. But also, very often what it means is that we can't just look to the point where sort of we have averted a crisis. Really the important element here would be, again, sort of longer term, more strategic thinking about how we can really take a successfully managed crisis as an opportunity to engineer, if you want, a real turnaround. So reversing patterns of exclusion and evolving or helping societies to evolve towards much more inclusive notions of citizenship, so that in the end, the real point of action would be that you enable local leaders across the entire spectrum of society, political leaders, religious leaders, leaders of particular ethnic communities. Business plays a very important role, really for them to come together and jointly own a sort of notion of inclusive citizenship that doesn't differentiate, that doesn't discriminate against people who speak a different language, who follow a different kind of religion than another group. And that, I think, requires long-term and sustained involvement of external actors. But also, I think what is important is sort of to realize that it's not a one-off. I mean, you don't sort of find a solution, you put it down, and that's it. It is, I mean, in that sense, inclusive citizenship is it's almost like a process. I mean, it constantly needs to be managed, maintained, and in a way, again, the point about the early warning really is that it's much easier to maintain a consensus about inclusive citizenship than actually having to try to restore the kind of pluralism that we would aspire for societies to have. I think part of the problem here is that this is simply an issue that is relatively understudied, and it's also less well understood because a lot of academic research, a lot of efforts that governments put into either managing their own diversity issues or helping other countries managing theirs is focused at crisis situations. It's focused on the breakdown, on the failure of pluralism. But that said, I mean, we do have a number of societies who exhibit certain risk factors, but who have managed for many, many years, decades, in some cases centuries, to live with these risk factors. I And I think it's those countries that we need to study. So I think in that sense, what would be really useful in sort of complementing early warning in the sense of the more upstream thinking about preventing pluralism failures and breakdowns would be to look at cases where you had risk factors, where these risk factors have been managed, where situations have been turned around, but also at the same time understanding why this may not have been possible in other cases, so that we understand better what the critical junctures are, at which choices are being made that determine whether you go down one road or you go down another road. And then we can also understand better what the options are. And the key issue here is not to think about this as a kind of blueprint, of a kind of one-size-fits-all solution. Yes, I think it's important to have a consensus on what inclusive citizenship means, why we think that this is normatively important, sort of have a commitment to certain principles. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every country benefits in the same way from a proportional electoral system and a parliamentary democracy or a power-sharing democracy. It's really about a context-sensitive implementation, so giving meaning in a very specific way to what inclusive citizenship can mean. And I mean, in one country, it may be you have to have a very rigid consociational setup where you predetermine who sits in the government and who holds which portfolios in the cabinet. And in another case, it might be as effective and more, in a sense, sensitive to a particular country's history to say, well, really what we need is we need an advisory council that we select from all the different relevant communities in our society, representatives, and that advisory council then gives meaning, makes a reality of the idea of inclusive citizenship. So I think in that sense, this is not about a particular model of a government. This is about a shared sense that if we have a normative commitment to individual human beings being equal, then they have equal rights to participate in society, economically, socially, culturally, politically. And we need to give this normative commitment a real concrete meaning. And I think this is where conditions of peace, in a sense, then can become more concrete. And these conditions of peace will vary from country to country. And I think we have to give up on the notion that there is sort of one magic bullet that will fix everything. And sometimes we call it human rights, and sometimes we call it democracy, and sometimes we call it non-discrimination. And I think all of these elements in different mixes are important. But we also have to be sensitive to particular cultural, geographical, historical contexts in which some of these concepts are not without controversy, are not without feelings of a Western imposition, for example. And that too often distracts from sort of an underlying commitment to, if you want, human dignity. And I think this is really important. And if we sort of think about this on a spectrum of inclusion and exclusion, where exclusion is a very, very dangerous and normatively difficult concept, and where we need to move towards more inclusion, towards giving people more opportunities to participate fully in the life of their societies, I think then we can get away from some of these distracting and rather divisive debates that take us away from the real issues of preventing the kinds of failures and breakdowns of pluralism that cause so many caused so much human suffering. Well, I think the way that you would do that is through scenario building. I mean, you would then sort of think, either sort of you go there and you discuss with people, well, okay, this is where you are right now. So what do you think are the most likely scenarios over the next 10 years, and what will determine that one or the other will come about, and which of those do you think are better or worse? So you can basically do a sort of a consensual exercise, which might also be quite useful actually as something to prevent potential breakdowns, where actually, I mean, if you can get people to agree, well, actually, we don't want violence, we do respect, or we do accept or acknowledge the fact that actually, in order to avoid that, everybody needs to have a little bit of a voice, a little bit of a sense of being included. I mean, that's, in a way, that's a very effective confidence-building measure, because then suddenly you can show to people, well, you agree on the basic principles of how to run your country, and then on the basis of that consensus, you can actually take them through particular options and solutions. And then if you have sort of a broader set of cases, you can say, well, now look, you are at a stage now where another country was 10 years ago. Now today, they have massive civil war, and the civil war came about because they made 1, 2, 3, 4 fateful choices at these critical junctures. So in that sense, you can then actually be much more proactive in preventing certain choices being made that may look right at the time, but where you can point to a parallel case and can say, well, look, if you do this, then the next challenge will be that, and you'll be tempted to make that choice, and that will take you down further. So for example, now if you look at Nigeria and Kenya, I mean, Kenya is not in a very different position from where Nigeria was, say 10 years ago, before Boko Haram. And I mean, Kenya has a similar challenge with Al-Shabaab. And you could even say Tanzania, which is also interesting, is almost a 50-50 split, very regionally 50-50 split between North and South, between Muslims and Christians. Now they are probably 20 years behind where Nigeria is now. And so that gives you the opportunity then to have the kind of early intervention and sort of monitor risks and monitor sort of patterns of exclusions and trajectories towards civil wars. But it's not in the sense sort of the model where you then sort of you feed all those big data into a computer and then it suddenly beeps when sort of something, which I mean, that would be ideal. I mean, then we could sort of construct that, work a year on that, put a couple of $1 million into it, and then we would be fine for the rest of time. But I think it's sort of taking these, taking this sort of knowledge of sort of what things happen and how they can go wrong, and sort of developing better insights, but not just about sort of trajectories towards violence, but also sort of what options you have and at what point you have these options in terms of actually making effective interventions, and who should make these interventions, and sort of what form they should take. So do you just, I don't know, form a grand coalition to sort out some tricky issues, or do you have sort of a formal process of constitutional reform, or do you have a massive international intervention, sort of massive state building, reform of institutions, the World Bank, the EU, the IMF, they all come in, help you restructure your country. And I think all of these have their place at different times, but also, I mean, country to country specific. And then I think if that were done in a more systematic way, I think Ukraine probably would have been avoidable. I mean, if we had knowledge of the kind that we now have earlier and looked at that, it would probably not have been necessary for Yemen to go that far down towards complete collapse. Again, I mean, there are also cases where we simply have to accept that, I mean, the set of options is so bad that no matter what we'll do, there will be costs, there will be trade-offs, and it cannot always be sort of everybody else's responsibility to fix a country if the country doesn't want to be fixed, or if the leaders there don't really want to engage constructively with one another.